So, it's a joy to be back. I must say, I can share something with Jack. 22 years on television, and if I had £1 for every person who said to me, oh, you look much bigger on the television. And I would either say, how big is your television then? Because that doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. Or alternatively, I would stand there and say, gosh, you're right, I'm quite small. I'd never noticed before. The joys of being in the television world. Now, I want to pick up on a theme that was started by Rosemary over that, which was on this issue of leadership. What is a leader? What constitutes a leader? And I'll tell you the story of somebody who you might think of as a leader, one of the British Prime Ministers, a guy called John Major. Anybody remember him? Yeah? Oh, good. I thought showbiz would have wiped him out, but there you go. Dear old John. Now, I'm going to have to do a John Major voice, because everybody's a John Major voice when they do John Major. I was on a trip to Washington with John Major. We went to the White House, and we're standing there outside the White House, all lined up, ready to do the after-meeting press conference, which you do. Now, everybody else in the world, there are about 20 cameras. I mean, it's a real bean feast, this. Everybody else in the world has a camera and a sound recordist, who's down here, and a reporter, who's here, except ITN, who clearly had no money. So we have a cameraman here, and we have a reporter and sound recordist, me, down here on the floor. So one of the things that's really awesome about a leader, a genuine leader, somebody who shows leadership, and I'm thinking of Bill Clinton here, is that Clinton walked out and somehow he appeared much bigger than he actually was. Unfortunately, our own Prime Minister appeared much smaller than he actually was, and he sort of trailed along in his wake as Clinton came out. And Clinton came out, of course, he did the big thing. Oh, hi there, good to see you, Bob. Good to see you, Stephanie. Okay. Right, what questions have you got? So he goes on, and he does all his questions. He takes his questions, and eventually, John gets a little voice in every now and then, see? So eventually, I'm down there on the floor, and I say, Mr. President, what are you going to do about Bosnia? And obviously Clinton looks down and he thinks, why is this sound recordist asking me a question? So he thinks, I'll just ignore him. Well, Jack, it's one thing about little men. You never ignore a little man, okay? Napoleon. Just one word I say to you, Napoleon. And I'm slightly taller than Napoleon was. So eventually, I shout the question, obviously, which is what little men do. I shouted the question, Mr. President, what are you going to do about Bosnia? And Clinton says, well, that's a very good question. I'm going to ask that question now. So he does a long answer. And at the end of it, I turn my microphone towards John Major, expecting him to answer. And Clinton says, Jack, you got another question over there? So I think, oh, this is awful. I've only got Clinton on this very vital issue. So I looked up at our Prime Minister, and I said, Prime Minister, you've got to say something about Bosnia. And our fine leader looked down at me on the floor, and he said, I'm trying to. I hope that gives you a sympathetic impression of what an impressive chap he was. Leadership, what constitutes a leader? Now, I'll give you a little simple example from my own world of journalism. Who do you expect to be a leader? I'm there in a Chechen refugee camp. There are thousands. The Russians have, in their very sympathetic, surgical way, destroyed Chechnya. So these refugees have all left. And in the middle of this great huge, I shouldn't say herd, horde is what I meant, Freudian, great horde of refugees, there's this very tall chap in a three-piece pinstripe suit. I thought, how very interesting. What on earth is he doing there? He looked so inappropriate. So, of course, I went over and said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm the head of the veterinary service for Chechnya. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, they bombed my office and they've destroyed my home. So I'm here. And I said, well, you're in a three-piece suit. He says, my dear chap, you have to maintain standards. No, you don't. You're in a refugee camp. So as I was then wandering through the refugee camp, I got to know a 17-year-old girl. Very quiet, very respectful, Muslim girl. She had organised a self-help, self-delivery thing for making sure that the food got to all families who perhaps were too ill or too elderly to go and get the food themselves from the agencies who were delivering it. Now I ask you, who's the leader? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's the 17-year-old who had probably never been noticed until that time, who didn't need the trappings of power, or prestige, or a three-piece suit to lead her community. She just needed the desire that every single person in this room shows, exemplifies, and models so finely. It's that business of leading your community by example. It doesn't take an office, it doesn't take a three-piece suit, or a flash car. It takes a heart, and of course it takes a head. And I think that's exactly what you do. Now there are other examples of leadership which I can't fail to share with you before I move on to the issue of communication, which is what I'm actually here for. So you're going to say, God, he is rattle on, isn't he? Look, there's one other example which I love, and it came from my time in Russia. And apologies to anybody who was here last week, because I told this story last week. I'll try and tell it differently. Very funny how different cultures communicate with the media. And this is an example of that. We went to St. Petersburg when Tony Blair, remember him? Yeah? Okay. About to be President of Europe. There's an odd job. Gosh. So, Tony Blair's there, he turns up, and Vladimir Putin, he's the one who poses half naked. That's the guy. Fishing or bear hunting or whatever else. And Alistair Campbell, if anybody remembers him. Actually quite a nice guy, Ali, if you like that sort of thing. Alistair Campbell was there, and so I signed that I would really like to ask a question. So he says, okay, Mark, yes, you can have the second question. We're going to let the Russians ask the first question. So he turns to the Russian journalist, and the Russian journalist says, I would like to ask Mr. Tony Blair. Those who were here last week will vouchsafe that all my accents morph into one. This could be Welsh, for all that matters. I would like to ask Mr. Prime Minister Tony Blair what his first impressions are of Russia. Ooh, tough question, eh? Oh. But he dealt with it. And then he said, right, Mark Webster from ITN. And I said, yes. I'd like to ask you, Tony Blair, what sort of signal it sends to the human rights lobby around the world. That you're prepared to stand there on an international stage next to a man whose armed forces are committing untold atrocities in Chechnya, even as we speak. Some of that appalling brutality I have had to witness myself. It went very quiet. And then Tony did his, now look. The famous Tony, now look. And he answered his question. And during this period, I realised that Vladimir Putin's eyes were bearing into the side of my head. I can always feel the scorch marks as he's looking at me. I thought, I don't think he's happy. He then answered, and he did completely lose his temper. I mean, totally lost his temper. Used words which was, afterwards people said they had never heard used at an international press conference before. The poor old translator was having to make up words as he went along to cover up the language that Putin was using. But we got to the end, and I got a great answer. And everybody's packing up and going home, and a guy called Yastrasensky, who's Putin's press secretary, big tall guy, not that I noticed, big tall guy, comes up and he looks down from a great height. And he said, you are Mark Webster, yes, of Independent Television News London. I said, I am. You are a very brave man. But I'm still alive.